Hi, I'm Marc Lynch, Director of the Project on Middle East Political Science and the Institute for Middle East Studies at George Washington University. Welcome back to the POMEPS Conversations, our series of chats with leading scholars in the field about their work. With me today is Marc of St. Antony's College at Oxford University, and someone who has been living in Tunisia for 3 years.
Going on 4 years.
Going on 4 years and working on her dissertation on Islamist movements and in Tunisia. So Monica, welcome to George Washington University.
Thanks so much.
So tell me a little bit about, you've been living in Tunisia, you've been observing the Al-Nahda movement and party up close, you've been looking at the Salafis. Tell me, what do you think that people outside of Tunisia are getting wrong or not seeing about these movements?
Right. Oftentimes, Tunisia has been seen from the outside as a simple conflict between secularists and Islamists. And the main problems for post-revolutionary Tunisia have often been seen through a very ideological, kind of dichotomized lens, right? So it's an identity crisis between the modernist progressives and Islamists who range from An-Nahda, which is like this Brotherhood-like movement, to violent radical Salafis, and we don't tend to make many distinctions between them. But on the ground, it feels very different. The major problems, challenges for Tunisia after the revolution haven't been simple ideological challenges. They've often been broader structural challenges. Things like lack of economic development, high youth unemployment, an unreformed judiciary, unreformed military and penal codes, and lack of security sector reform. Now, over top of all of those bedrock challenges, we tend to paste the ideological challenges. And then we go one step further often, and we tend to use words like Islamism or Salafism as these conceptual rubbish bins, waste baskets, into which we toss everything we don't understand. So a bearded, disaffected youth, a political candidate running for An-Nahda, a guy who identifies as an Ansar Sharia member tend to all go in similar categories.
Now, I've heard you say before that one of the real problems that the analytical community has is we see everything through the lens of Egypt.
Right.
And that's why people get it wrong, because they see Al-Nahda and they think Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. They see the Salafis and they think Hizb al-Nur.
Right.
So tell me why that's wrong, because I know you think it's wrong.
I absolutely think it's wrong, you're right. I think one of the reasons this happens is because Egypt is a much more populous country, and traditionally it's been a country that has more Western, especially Anglophone, journalists and academic researchers. So we have lots of material coming out of Egypt, both press and academic. And so people who've done their dissertations on Egypt or have journalistic experience in Egypt tend to look out from Egypt to the rest of the region, and there's a kind of Egypt effect that gets produced. So when you talk within categories like Islamism, you tend to start throwing or clustering movements together that might not have as much in common as we think they have. So An-Nahda and the Muslim Brotherhood is the classic example. Everybody wants to compare these two all the time.
What's different about An-Nahda and the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood? What are people missing by using that analogy?
Right. I think Tunisia is fundamentally a really different kind of society than Egypt. After the revolutions in 2011, I would come to Egypt and then go back to Tunisia and talk to my Tunisian friends. And across the board, everybody, including Islamists and Salafis and self-proclaimed secular modernists, would say, man, things are not going as well as we'd like them to go. And you'd say, well, I just came back from Egypt, and things in Egypt were much worse. You guys are doing really well, don't worry. And they'd say, don't compare us to Egypt. They say, compare us to Portugal. Egyptians, man, half of them can't read and write. So
there's like this class.
There tends to be a feeling broadly amongst all Tunisians that they're better educated, that they're more modern, it's more of a secular society. And indeed, on the ground, Tunisia does feel a lot less conservative than Egypt. Economically, it's doing quite a bit better. Educationally, Ben Ali baked a lot of the statistics, and we bought the statistics he baked, and we're realizing how much worse it was than we thought. But still, Tunisia is doing a lot better. So, Islamist movements are social movements. One member of An-Nahda in Tunisia told me that to really understand Islamist movements, you need to see them as rivers. And they take their color from the bedrock and the soil underneath. So the bedrock in the soil here in Tunisia, he said, is very different than it is in Egypt. So like any social movement, Islamist movements have to operate within an opportunity matrix that's very local and very contextual. So the topography of Tunisian culture and Tunisian opportunities, what's possible there is very different. Many people, even Egyptians coming to Tunisia, will say that the Tunisian political spectrum starts to the left of the Egyptian political spectrum. So a member of Ennahda in Tunisia, which is the local Islamist movement, would look like a liberal in the Egyptian context.
So if you look at Ennahda, I mean, they don't really look to the Muslim Brotherhood for guidance. They don't look at them as a model to emulate.
Right. The relationship between Ennahda in Tunisia and the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is a kind of loose familial relationship. Ennahda tends to view itself as the progressive cousin to the more intransigent, stick-in-the-mud uncle who is the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. Ennahda got its start in the 1970s. The Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood was a much older movement that started in the 20s and 30s. And in the 70s and 80s, when Ennahda was starting out, it called itself not Ennahda, but the Islamic Tendency Movement. And it took some of its color and inspiration from the Muslim Brotherhood, but then it evolved and it grew in a much more national, locally colored, Tunisian-specific direction.
And then
so now it's very much its own thing.
But then it was crushed and expelled.
That's right.
In a way that the Egyptian Muslim Brothers were not.
That's right, which put Ennahda in a very different position after the revolution. Whereas the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood had always existed in Egyptian society and had this whole kind of parallel state network of social welfare and outreach.
And you just didn't have that in Tunisia.
You just didn't have that. And so this helped Ennahda in some ways, because after the revolution, it was able to come back either from lying underground or from exile and really assert itself as a political, not a religious movement. So the distinction wasn't as blurred as it was in the Egyptian case. And also Ennahda didn't have this problematic past of collaboration with the old regime, because it was a very clear-cut case of oppression.
And yet some things, the trajectories look fairly similar, though, where they rise to power through elections, and then they seem to alienate sectors of society, and then they fall from power, but without the whole thing falling apart the way that it did in Egypt.
Right.
Why do you think that Ennahda had these problems in government, and why do you think they reacted the way that they did to those problems?
In the elections of October 2011, I told a lot of my Tunisian anti-Ennahda friends that what they should really hope for is an Ennahda victory, because the next few years are going to be extremely difficult, and whatever party holds power is almost guaranteed to fall on its face. And Ennahda, in some ways, certainly did. There was lack of experience in government. Tunisians in the 2011 elections had a fundamental choice to make between figures who had experience, but their experience was in a kind of tainted dictatorial regime, or the new guys, the new kids on the block, who, yes, they had clean hands, fresh faces, but maybe they would be incompetent. They didn't understand the internal structures of the bureaucracies, etc. Right. So Ennahda had major problems finding usable bureaucracy in Tunisia, exerting governance. Being in government, at the helm of government, didn't mean it had power.
But what about earlier on you were somewhat dismissive of the idea of there being these identity conflicts, but I mean, there is this very intense anti-Islamist, anti-Ennahda movement that you see in the media and in public opinion, the whole Nida Tunis phenomenon. It seems like there's something going on there. Right.
Well, I think Tunisia isn't so different from the United States or Britain or France or hardly any other country. The media tends to whip up a lot of phantasmagorical conflicts. And these conflicts are then stirred more by certain politicians in whose interest it is to have people think that this is the major cleavage, this is the major dividing line in society. You don't have, for example, economic reporting in Tunisia. No investigative economic journalism almost at all, or budgetary reporting. Even though the economy is one of the two major grievances, along with security. You don't have informed conversations about these issues. Instead, you have a great deal of fear-mongering in Tunisian media, which is almost entirely unreformed, painting Islamists as terrorists, as Salafists, and using this kind of lexical sleight of hand to conflate categories and say that Ennahda was responsible for all the failures of government, including terrorism, the rise of Salafi jihadism, etc.
Let's shift gears just for the last few minutes. I know you've also been studying the Salafis in Tunisia, and I think you think that they're really misunderstood. So tell me, what do you think the most important things to know about the Salafi movement, this emergent movement in Tunisia? What is it that we need to know?
Right. You know, when people talk about foreign fighters, particularly Tunisian fighters, going to join ISIS, they often see these kids as a bearded army of very intimidating people who then go and cut off others' heads. The way I met a lot of these,
kind of is.
which ISIS definitely is. ISIS definitely is.
Yeah.
But my experience with Tunisian Salafi jihadis, the kind of young people who aspired to or actually went to fight with ISIS, which only became ISIS really last year, was limited. It was about 18 to 20 young people that I interviewed over the course of a few years. And these young people started off talking about Syria as a place where they could be freedom fighters. Something maybe like people might have talked about fighting Franco in Spain in the 1930s. To them, it felt like a freedom fight. To them, it felt like a way to find identity when maybe they had a degree as a biology teacher but couldn't find work teaching biology. What did that mean? Why was their life important? It was often a shortcut to identity. So we tend to look, I think, at the phenomenon of Salafism in Tunisia as being very hardened and very violent from the beginning, but it often comes from a more quotidian place. Young people from often marginalized backgrounds trying to find meaning in their lives.
But it's not just ISIS, though. There were the clashes on the universities that you've written about, and things like that. You know, where do they fit within Tunisian society? I mean, how do they define themselves in relation to Ennahda or in relation to this unreformed state?
Well, you have many types of Salafism, right? The word Salafi is a very flexible word that, like Islamism, often confuses more than it clarifies. When we talk about the kinds of violent Salafis who are often really aggressive in their preaching or want to join ISIS or join ISIS, we're talking about Salafi jihadis in Tunisia. And these young people were very critical of Ennahda from the get-go. A handful of them voted for Ennahda, very small number. We don't have actual figures, but from all the qualitative research done, it looks like a very tiny number. And early on, in late 2011, early 2012, they were very quick to then disavow Ennahda and say that it was a kind of handmaiden to the United States, a sellout party, not actually Islamist at all. And they swore they would never vote again.
Well, I was going to say, did they disavow Ennahda or did they disavow democracy?
Well, they thought...
These Salafi, not the jihadists, but like these other Salafis that you were interviewing.
Well, I think most Salafis, quietist and jihadi, etc., across the board, didn't vote because they viewed democracy and politics in general as impious and pointless. We should instead live pious lives, preach, and prepare the ground for a theocratic state, right? A handful of them didn't. They felt like the game is changing after the revolution. We have the opportunity to really change the board. And Ennahda is this Islamist party. Maybe it's going to really change the board. That means upset the game, not play the democratic game, but get elected and then completely change the board to have a Sharia state. And they very quickly recognized that's not what Ennahda was about. And of course, Ennahda felt like these guys know nothing about us. But their opinions quickly changed about Ennahda. And many of them never bought it in the first place, never voted in the first place.
All right, well, Monica, thank you for joining us in the POMEPS Conversations. It's wonderful to have you here in Washington, and thanks for watching.
Thanks.